Welcome to this week's Short Clip Friday podcast. On Fridays, I will be posting clips from previous episodes. And the point here is just to bring you some of the highest yield topics from each podcast in order to kind of reinforce those topics. This clip is from the Study Types and Research Design podcast. It covers validity, specificity, and sensitivity. Enjoy. So, validity refers to a test's or experiment's ability to measure what it's supposed to measure. And there are two different kind of categories of validity I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about experimental validity and test validity. So, in the case of experimental validity, this is looking at how the results of some experiment, it looks at the results of some experiment, whereas test validity looks at the validity of, you guessed it, a test. So, in terms of experimental validity, there are two main types: internal validity and external validity. So, internal validity basically asks whether the effects observed in the study are due to the manipulation of the independent variable. And so, this is basically saying, okay, is your experiment a good experiment? And so, this is why you run your experiment with controls and you make sure that you don't have any confounding variables that are affecting what you're trying to measure. And so then you have external validity, and external validity refers to the extent to which the study can be generalized to another setting, which is called ecological validity, to other people, which is called population validity, or to another period of time, which is historical validity. And so a quick example of this is when we take an animal study, say we're trying to test some new kind of drug, and first we test that drug on mice, right? And that's because we can then extrapolate that data to humans. So this is a type of populational validity. Is your study valid from mice, and can we extrapolate that then to humans? So again, internal validity refers to how good your experiment is. External validity, how well does your experiment apply to other situations? So for test validity, there's a few different types I'm going to talk about. And so in this case, a test is something like a questionnaire, an IQ test, etc. And so there's two kind of main types of test validity. There's criterion validity, which measures how well one measure predicts an outcome for another measure. And then we also have content validity, which is how legitimate is the test at measuring what it claims to measure, i.e., are you asking the right questions in order to be able to draw conclusions? So in terms of criterion validity, we have concurrent validity, which asks, does the test measure relate to an existing measure? So let's give an example of an IQ test. Say researchers are inventing some new IQ test, and then they'll take that new IQ test and ask, okay, how do people score compared to the normal original IQ test? And if those scores are very similar, then you'll say that your new test has concurrent validity. Another type of criterion validity is predictive validity. So this asks, does the test predict performance on a related criteria? i.e., is your test good at predicting? So, you say you take again your new IQ test. Now you look at some other measure of intelligence and you say, how well does this correlate? How well does this predict how this individual is going to score on some other intelligence test? So let's talk now about content validity. Again, content validity is how legitimate is the test at measuring what it says it's measuring. So in terms of content validity, we have construct validity, which is which asks, does this test relate to the underlying theoretical concepts? So for your new IQ test, you'd say, okay, does this new test actually test intelligence? Does this relate to the theoretical concepts behind intelligence? Well, this as of now is kind of debated within different branches of science. Obviously, I'm sure you've heard people say, "Oh, IQ test doesn't actually test intelligence. That thing sucks." And some people are very big proponents of the IQ test. But just understand that construct validity asks whether your test relates to the underlying theoretical concepts. And lastly, in content validity, we have face validity. And that basically asks the question, does this look like it'll test what it says it tests? And this is kind of the least sophisticated measure of validity. Imagine yourself just kind of glancing over this new IQ test that you've made and asking, okay, does this look like it would test intelligence? If it was something like, number one, go run 20 miles, and then number two, do 40 push-ups, and obviously you're going to say, okay, this doesn't test intelligence. On its face, it does not look valid. And of course, this is a kind of a superficial measure. But when you're first introduced to some tests, this is valuable in determining whether or not, this gives a first look at validity. It can be useful for that. So again, here we have two main types of validity that we're talking about. We're talking about experimental validity and test validity. Overall, I think experimental validity is the most important to know. And again, that breaks down into internal validity and external validity. So know these terms and understand how they can be applied to questions on the MCAT. All right, the last kind of variable I want to talk about here is specificity versus sensitivity. So test sensitivity is the ability of a test to correctly identify those with the disease. So these are called true positives. And on the other hand, you have test specificity, which is the ability of some tests to correctly identify those without the disease, and that's a true negative. And so when I'm talking test here, think about like some kind of diagnostic test. So let's talk about HIV, for instance. So when HIV was first detected back in the 1970s, doctors used an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay to detect HIV antibodies, also called an ELISA. And these antibodies typically took weeks to show up in the blood after a person got infected with HIV. So essentially, you could be very infected with HIV, have a very high viral load, and not be diagnosed. Why is that? Because it takes a buffer of a few weeks to develop those antibodies that then show up on the ELISA. So a lot of people, that were infected were not diagnosed and therefore could go on and infect more people. However, nowadays, they use a different method. So this is how it works now. Essentially, they take your blood and primers that are specific for different parts of the HIV viral genome, and very likely they'll use primers that bind to very conserved regions of the HIV genome. Obviously, viruses tend to mutate, so if it mutates and now your primers don't bind to that sequence, then you'd kind of be screwed. So they look for very conserved parts of the viral genome. They make these primers, and then what they do is they amplify these sequences using qPCR. And if you go back to the genetics podcast, you can hear a little bit about qPCR, but essentially that lets you see how much amplification is going on in a PCR over time. So you can watch that kind of live. So they throw all these ingredients in, you got primers, polymerase, probe, and if that they recognize there's, if they see some signal from your blood on this qPCR, they know that, okay, there's viral sequence, you likely have HIV virus that you're producing. And so this test was a lot better in terms of detecting patients when they were infected. So in this case, you want a test that is very sensitive, right? So you want a test that is able to correctly identify people who have the disease. You don't want people that have HIV to be slipping through the cracks. And you also want a test that is also specific, right? You don't want to be giving people a incorrect positive diagnosis for HIV. That would be not good. So it's important that a test is both specific and sensitive, and it's also important you understand the difference between specificity and sensitivity. Can't get into a hospital or doctor's office to do shadowing? Well, you're in luck. A fourth-year medical student and I just produced a virtual shadowing video series that is also a podcast. The idea here is to help pre-meds get some kind of clinical experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, since it's pretty hard to right now. I obviously have no idea how admissions committees are going to view this. Like, I don't know what they're going to say if you put it on your med school application, but I imagine that it's only going to help in that it's better than nothing. Throughout the recording of this series, I learned a ton, and I think you would too. So if you're interested, search virtual shadowing in your podcast app or visit shadowing.medschoolcoach.com.